everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presented by Ciphr, the UK General Election Result, What It Means for HR and Payroll. To note, the content of this webinar is based on publicly available information published before and after the Labour Party's victory in the election on 4th of July. This is not financial advice, nor is it legal advice, payroll advice, or employment law advice. If you need advice, please speak with an appropriate expert. I'm Catherine, I'm Ciphr's Head of Content and your moderator for today. Joining me are four of our in-house experts. I have Claire Williams, Chief People and Operations Officer. Hi Claire, welcome.
Morning.
And we also have Judy Lally, Managing Director of Payroll. Hi Judy.
Hi, morning everyone.
We also have Ira Hammond, Payroll Bureau and Transformation Director. Hi Ira.
Good morning.
And we have Claire Warner, Regulatory Analyst. Morning Claire.
Morning all.
Morning. Before I hand over to our experts, a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be emailed to you afterwards to rewatch or share with a friend or colleague. The public chat is open. Please use it to say hi, introduce yourself and share comments or questions. Note this webinar is focused on the facts of the new government's policy. We're not here to debate if they're right or wrong or in line with your personal political beliefs, just to talk about the potential impact on employers and HR and payroll professionals. Please be respectful and polite in the chat. Anyone who is aggressive or personally attacks other attendees will be removed from the broadcast. Thank you in advance for being respectful of others' opinions. In case you're new to Ciphr, here's a little bit about us. We're the leading HR and payroll software and solutions partner for medium and large organisations in the UK. Our integrated HR, payroll, learning and recruitment software, services and content provide invaluable insights to teams to inform their people strategy and grow and develop their organisations. We're on a mission to amplify the voice and value of HR through intelligent people data solutions that help HR be heard in the boardroom and across the business. We serve more than 600 clients and 1 million users. And as HR and payroll people ourselves, we know how to help you do your best work. We won't go into these products and services here today, but if you'd like to find out more, visit our website, ciphr.com, and arrange a time to speak with one of our team. With all that housekeeping out of the way, I'm going to hand over to Julie.
Thanks, Catherine. So there's a range of topics on the government's agenda, and these range from zero-hour contracts right the way through to changing rights for employees from day one of their employment. Now, all of these changes will have an impact on your internal processes. Some of these will impact the contracts of employment that you have for your employees, and some of these will require a change in the way organisations do their workforce planning. So the government have released some information, but not all at this stage. It's a little bit too early. So today what we're going to do in this session is focus on the information that we do have, the information that has been released. And we're going to look at how that impacts an organisation. We'll look at what HR need to do to get ready, what payroll need to do to implement, and what business leaders need to think about in order to prepare for these changes. I will note that we are going to follow this webinar with a series of micro webinars on each of the subjects as we get the completed versions. So please do continue to follow Ciphr. Following us will automatically mean that you get your invite to the next webinar. Thank you.
So we've obviously got a period of time now. We've got the initial 100-day pledge that Labour have committed to submitting to government on the workplace reforms, but that won't happen until the Parliament opens on the 17th of July. So what would have been 3.5 months, probably going to be more like 4 months until we have them introduced into Parliament by the 25th of October. In between that, we've obviously got the budget that will be set around September time. 25th of October is by no means when that is going to become new legislation in place. We're going to have a period beyond that around negotiating and debating before it becomes legally binding. But safe to say that we've probably got a year, well, at least a year, probably 4 years of substantial change in relation to the legislation that's going to be introduced off the back of the pledges that Labour have made. So we are going to dive into, first and foremost, the pay, national minimum wage and tax. And we're going to kick off with national minimum wage and over to Claire.
Right, gone too far.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so back where we're supposed to be. Okay, national minimum wage, scarily introduced in 1998. So apart from the regular increases in rates, it hasn't really been reviewed for 25 years. The new government have undertaken that they are going to review minimum wage. We don't know the details, we don't know the timing, but there has been mention of removal of the age bands, providing a single rate. What we don't know if that will mean the removal of the apprenticeship bandings as well, or there's going to be something different for them. There's also mention of the much contentious and debated issue of travel time, particularly for those workers who move between contracts. So carers in the community would be a prime example, where they potentially do not currently have to be paid for the time travelling between their appointments. The government have undertaken that issue will be addressed. Again, we don't know in what way it will be addressed or how the compliance and enforcement would go with that, but there will be key changes that the employers need to look at in terms of audit requirements, reporting requirements, and clearly some software changes that are all going to be required, whatever is forthcoming from that review. So over to the impact on payroll.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because payroll around the world relies so much on good systems to ensure our compliance and to make sure payroll's always accurate and on time. So when big legislation things come in, we really do need to be on the ball. So whether we're a payroll service provider like Ciphr, or we have our own internal software and perhaps an in-house payroll team, or whether you outsource your payroll to another provider, we have to be sure that the systems we have been updated to reflect the legislation changes that come into place. And with this national minimum wage change, especially the removal of the age bands, payroll teams need to do thorough testing when the software has been updated. Have a think now, but don't wait till it happens. Think now of the tests that you might want to perform so that you're prepared, because typically in payroll, we don't get a lot of time when the changes take effect and then have to be implemented. You don't always get that good lead time. So it's worth starting thinking now about the changes that you might want to make happen. Regarding to the additional pay proposed to workers between multiple sites, you may have to set your workers recording these additional hours and minutes so they can be paid at maybe one or several different rates. So again, start to think of the impact to your workers and what time recording might look like. It's probably a good idea when this happens to keep a close eye on those low earners. And also, although I'm not going to go into it, Claire will be quite happy about this, this change will likely have an impact on calculating holiday pay. But, you know, I'm just going to leave you with that thought for now.
Perfect. So obviously we've spoken a little bit about the fact that they're going to be removing the bandings, which was previously, we know, a conflict in relation to the age discrimination legislation we've got out there. We see that across various elements, such as how you calculate redundancy, that's also based on age. So it's good to see that some of that stuff's been brought in to remove that conflict. The main piece that you're going to be needing to work on from an HR perspective is clearly the work around reviewing your pay policies and the frameworks that sits within. The complexity will really vary depending on if you have, you know, how many people do you have on those on the current national minimum wage? Do you have apprentices? Do you have spines? Do you have grades? So really looking at your current pay framework and how that might need to change if they do bring in a single national minimum wage. That will mean a lot of upfront work, no doubt, for the people in the payroll teams, but longer term potentially could be easier to maintain, easier to manage, worth working with your software providers to see if they put in triggers to let you know if you've got anyone that's earning below that rate, or how you can work with any of those suppliers on that front. There is going to be a need to update contracts more than likely. I'm sure we've all got pay in there, but dependent again on how you structure your contracts, that will need a review. And also worth thinking about things like the impact on, are you currently a living wage employer? Is the new national minimum wage going to come up to that threshold? Will there be new standards in place? But this one in particular, is clearly impacting those lower earners, which will hopefully mean that there is a positive impact when we consider things like social mobility, but certainly a lot to be thinking about and preparing from an HR perspective in conjunction with those payroll teams.
From a business perspective, business leaders are going to need to be thinking about how they're going to fund this increase, because ultimately it will be an increase. They'll need to assess the impact on existing budgets. So let's start now having the conversations with boards to prepare when doing budgets for the next financial year. Let's put some consideration into the budget now for that. But ultimately, in order to pay for it, business leaders are going to have to increase productivity. So there's a whole conversation that needs to take place around the board table about how that's going to happen.
Technology is great. That's good. Right. Okay. So moving on to SSP then, little bit of a history lesson for some of you. I mentioned earlier when I was chatting with these ladies that I remember the introduction of SSP. So introduced as far back as 1983, with the last significant change being 1985. So almost 40 years. And apart from the employer's ability to claim back those costs for most employers, there hasn't been a review since. The government has suggested that they are going to review this, and that's likely to include things like the removal of the lower earnings limit threshold, making SSP available to all low-income workers, and will abolish the 3 waiting days as well, expanding the payment to, again, more people. They propose a fair earnings replacement rate for those that earn below the LEL. But again, we have no concrete details on that. What we can say is that according to figures published by the TUC, these changes will benefit 1.3 million people, 70% of whom are women. And that includes people that might have multiple jobs with different employers where they each earn below the LEL, and those not claiming any state benefits. The TUC also states that at the moment, around 70% of sick days don't qualify for SSP. So these amendments would be a significant change, not only to software, but to costs for employers and processes. So for a bit more information on that, I'm going to pass over to the rest of the team to discuss.
Thanks, Claire. Okay, so thanks for the reminder, Claire, that the last big change, or SSP, came in 1983. I don't know how many people are on the webinar that remember that time. Yeah, I certainly do. And it's, yeah, a bit shocking that we've been calculating SSP since back in the 80s. You know, SSP is one of those things that I've seen payroll teams struggle where systems don't calculate SSP correctly. I've probably seen more spreadsheets than I care to recall where payroll manually record SSP. It not necessarily because systems don't work, but it could be that they just don't trust the systems or they have their own little quirks. It's now the time likely that we're going to have to relearn how to calculate SSP. We're going to have to relearn the calculations, removing, like Claire said, the lower earnings limit, starting calculating SSP from day one. They're quite big changes in terms of what the net result of the SSP calculation is going to be, and there is likely to need to have considerable software changes, and those who are using spreadsheets are going to have to carefully revise those. But payroll people are resilient, and once the legislation's published, I'm sure we'll be confident in the changes we need to make. But in the meantime, until we know what those specific calculations are, my tip is use the time now to look at your process, look at your systems, look at the calculations, especially around national minimum wage and SSP and all the associated calculations, because you can start making improvements to those processes right now in advance of those changes taking place. So all we can say is on these, watch this space, and we'll update you as and when we get that info. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you. So from an HR perspective, again, a significant change. And it's worth reminding everyone that obviously currently the impact of not having those first few days paid does have other impacts that are going to need to be considered. So currently people are using holiday to cover that sickness. People are potentially having to work because they can't afford to take the time off, and therefore are bringing those sick bugs potentially into the workplace. You've also probably got the impact where you've got people that are suffering from longer term sickness, where they're unable to take those short term periods of leave to recover from whatever it is they're suffering from at the time. So there's going to be some additional knock on that's worth thinking about, as opposed to just solely focusing on those policies and procedures, which are clearly going to need to change. I think some of the things to think about when we're considering what those changes might look like are: do you already have an occupational sick pay scheme, a company sick pay scheme that overrides the statutory sick pay? How are you going to make sure that they continue to work in harmony if it's a day one right? We need to think about potentially more active management of the absence from the start. So improving self-certification records could be one of the areas you want to look at. And also thinking about, are there ways you can put in place rehabilitation and return to work plans at an earlier stage? There's going to be a lot of technical unpicking when it comes to processes, not only on the payroll side, but again, thinking about, again, if you have a digitalized or automated process using software solutions, you're going to have to rework those processes to make sure that that absence recording is following through along with those revised procedures. I think it will be really critical, regardless, that you are really monitoring the change in workplace behaviours. Is this going to see an uptick in absence? And I know Julie's going to speak a bit more on this, and productivity. So thinking again early on about how those revised processes also are going to be monitored and recorded so that you can track the impact on the workplace over a period of time.
Good news is for businesses is that this reform will absolutely lead to a happier and healthier workforce. It'll reduce the passing of illnesses in the workplace because people will feel empowered to take a 24, 48-hour period out of work to get over something like a cold or a stomach bug, etc. It'll also stop employees from worrying about being financially impacted if they are unwell. And one of the other things that we were discussing around this is when people take holiday leave for short-term absences so that they're not financially impacted. But we all need our holidays to get proper rest so that we're super productive and healthy when we're at work. So there's a lot of good that will come out of this change. However, there are things that we need to consider when gearing up for this. Leaders will need to address an increase in short-term sick leave, because it will happen, and how we're going to cover it. So advice would be, start looking now at cross-skilling. What's your cross-skill matrix within each of your departments within your organisation? Have you got enough cover? You'll need to increase it because you're going to see an increase of ad hoc days absences. Now, some organisations may even need to consider engaging agencies, if they don't already, just to make sure that they've got that emergency cover. And finally, the last thing that leaders will need to consider is how we fund this. And again, this comes back down to, can we increase our productivity to ensure that we can pay for these changes?
Okay, so In the Labour manifesto, it clearly stated that there would be no change in headline rates of tax, national insurance and VAT. Great. Everybody is like, yay, tax isn't going to go up. However, we should remember that although that does mean the bandings for the tax will not change, there has so far not been any mention of removing the freeze on personal allowances or changing the tax bandings, both of which could have a potential to increase tax without changing the rates. We have also, as yet, not had any indication on what the devolved governments are going to do. So Scotland and Wales both have the right to set their own tax rates and bandings. Now, Scotland have been doing it for a few years, but Wales have yet to implement that. That's not to say they're not going to from now. So it's very much let's watch this space and see potentially what those devolved governments are going to do, which will impact on, do we have the right address for employees, for example, and that sort of stuff sitting around in the background. So yeah, there's a positive that tax isn't going to increase, but let's be aware that there are different ways to increase tax. That's not, I don't want to be negative about it, but we just need to understand what they might do that's going to impact us in the workplace. So we're now going to move on to the next section, which is, if I can make it work, employment rights and contracts. And we're going to hand over to Claire for this.
Thank you. So getting into the nitty-gritty of the HR world, a lot of the pieces around employment rights, status, contracts and time off, as you can see here, there is much more that we've seen come through that we will be updating you on when we have more detail, but we've just pulled out some of those key big ticket items that no doubt you guys are going to be interested in, as are we, on what that's going to look like. So the first one is contracts. So this concept of banning 0 hours contracts, although they have already said that they will still likely allow these in certain scenarios. So I don't think they're going to be banned completely, but certainly a look to have change the way zero hours contracts are managed so that workers have the right to contracts that reflect the number of hours that they regularly work based on a 12-week reference period. So that will be a marked change, but also things like reasonable notice of any change in shifts or working time with compensation that is proportionate to the notice given in relation to those cancellations. So that's going to be quite a significant change. It will be quite interesting when we also move on to looking at the employment status side, how this conflicts with the growing kind of gig economy and those people that actually want to be working for multiple different organisations on that very flexible basis. So lots to kind of consider from that perspective. Next, we're looking at the employment rights. So again, another really significant change for HR individuals and for employers. You know, currently employees with less than 2 years service don't currently benefit from the protection against unfair dismissal. So that does give employers the ability right now to circumvent the ACAS Code of Practice to in relation to dismissing employees with less than 2 years service. What they are proposing is that from day one, employees will have the right to make an unfair dismissal claim. That is going to significantly increase the amount of work employers have to do. And also it will see a huge uptick in tribunal claims, which will be really interesting to see how they cope with that, considering there is already such a significant backlog when you look at the amount of tribunal claims that are waiting to be heard post-COVID. One of the things that they have said is that they are probably going to still allow probation periods to operate. An interesting one there for us to think about in relation to lots of employers. Julie and I were speaking earlier, lots of employers have removed probation periods. We have removed probation periods from a cultural perspective of making our employees feel like they're part of the organisation from day one and don't have this, probation period hanging over their head where they could be cut at a minute's notice without very little actual notice to be paid. So there's a lot there for us to consider. It will mean that employees need to get the hiring right, and it will mean that probation period is really closely managed. Those performance measures are in place, and that employers are really working by the book in relation to how they're hiring and firing employees from that point forward. We've also got the abolition of fire and rehire, or as many of us may know this, dismissal and re-engagement. So this is ending the practice of fire and rehire as a lawful means to impose unilateral changes to employees' contracts of employment. Now, we saw this with the P&O incident. Gosh, was that last year now? I'm trying to think of timings. It's been a little bit of time, but a really extreme scenario where an employer was really able to take advantage of that legislation to impose terms that were really quite unfair and quite extreme. So we've got the new statutory code of practice on dismissal and re-engagement, which is due to come out in July 18th anyway. But the proposal is that this will be replaced by new laws designed to regulate the practice of firing and rehiring employees in order to change their terms of employment. So significant changes on both of those points that employers will need to be really, really prepared for. Next up, employment status. So again, thinking about this gig economy, how this is all going to change. At the moment, we recognise 3 types of employment status. We've got employees, we've got workers, which is inclusive of employees, as we know, and also self-employed contractors. So the review is to move to a single status of worker with a simplified 2-part framework that sits across being employed or a self-employed worker, and also strengthening the rights and protection for self-employed people. So this is including the right to a written contract, action to tackle late payments. You know, that is something that self-employed people really can suffer with. You know, they are one-man bands in lots of instances, and if you're working for doing some self-employed work for organisations that then take several months to pay, that can be really difficult to manage. Along with extending health and safety and blacklisting protections to the self-employed, and strengthening trade union rights. So lots of change going in there. Again, lots to consider in relation to, I think, Claire Warner, you were talking earlier about the impact on things like IR35.
IR35, auto-enrolment categorisation, for example, could be impacted on this. So there's a lot of stuff that sits behind these changes that it's going to have like branch effects, if you like. So one small change here can have an impact in pensions legislation, for example. IR35 legislation might need to change. It might be as simple as the terminology that's used, because in some places we use employee where it should be worker, or worker where it should be employee. So those are the terms that maybe need to be considered when you're reviewing contracts, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all going to need a massive overhaul, and it's going to be a huge amount of work for HR and payroll teams to undertake, to not only understand the legislation, but then think about how are they enforcing those safeguards in their day-to-day hiring and firing and management of employees. So big changes there to consider. We've then got finally some bits that are coming in around time off. I think there's some, again, as I said, there is a lot more that sits in this category of employment rights, but we've pulled out some of these key ones around time off because there's been a lot more publicity around these pieces in particular. So starting with flexible working, as we know, April this year, flexible working changed to be a day one right within the UK to be able to request flexible working. But the change is that this will be made as a default to all workers on day one of employment. So it's a slight nuance, but will be a fundamental change. And it's about the employer then accepting this unless it is not reasonably feasible. I don't think it's necessarily going to see a huge increase in the amount of people that are requesting or expecting to work flexibly, but it is going to mean that employers need to take a different approach as to how they're managing those changes and those requests. And within that, also around this kind of flexible working has been the piece that's come in around the right to switch off or the right to disconnect. And this is just about instilling boundaries between home and work life, and making sure that that's maintained. So much more around protecting the worker and their rights in that work-life balance aspect.
On right to disconnect, there is new legislation in Ireland that's been brought in recently around this. Belgium also have something similar. So if anybody wants an idea of which way we might be going, it might be worth going and having a look at those pieces of legislation, because it's about making sure that the home office doesn't become 24/7 access. We've all got Teams on our phones, for example. So what is the right for people to respond when they're on their lunch break or on the weekend? It's trying to move away from that 24/7 availability, and as Julie said earlier, giving people the opportunity to actually decompress and heal or recover, or just get some clear headspace on that one.
Yeah, I think it's all about protection, isn't it? It's all just making sure that there is the legislation in place so that employees aren't exploited. Lots of people love working excessive hours, maybe few and far between, but there are those out there that do. And I think it's about making sure that it's more of a framework which employees and employers can work with, that mean that employees are protected. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what that actually looks like when it lands. They've also made quite a lot of commitments around parental leave and what they're going to do there. In particular, they've committed to a review of unpaid parental leave. So this is the current entitlement to parents with at least 1 year's service that can take up to 18 weeks of unpaid leave for each child until the age of 18. Their proposal is that this will be available to all employees from day one of their employment, all parents at least from day one of their employment, not all employees necessarily. So that's one of the suggestions that they're making in relation to parental leave.
At this point, we should be clear, there is no indication that paid statutory parental leave, such as maternity, paternity and shared parental leave, will be reviewed. However, it feels like they're literally reviewing the entire statutory leave opportunities. Some of these have been in place quite a while, so it wouldn't surprise me if there's more to come on this from a paid parental leave point of view. Although we have quite generous terms in the UK compared to some countries, we are still behind other European countries. So there is that to consider too.
Yeah, and I think certainly they've mentioned about the extension of rights for pregnant workers. So this extension of how long they're protected beyond returning from maternity leave, as opposed to just during their pregnancy and during their mat leave. So there's certainly, I think, going to be more emphasis on the work they're doing around the rights and the protection for parents in the workforce, which hopefully will be a positive. But again, it will be another hurdle for employers to then accommodate and work with, and there will be a cost impact. But again, hopefully it's strengthening the rights of employees at the same time.
Yeah, if we want to look at the statutory bereavement leave statement that was also included, there is already bereavement leave in place for those unfortunate enough to lose a child. But is this going to be an extension of what we already have? Who would be entitled? What is that core family? We don't any longer really have that nuclear family. So families are very diverse and varied these days. So what would that who would that bereavement leave cover, for example? Does it cover your step grandma that might have been in your life for all of your life, but wouldn't necessarily be considered as immediate family by some employers? So I think that's going to be an interesting one to look at as well. And then the paid carers leave. Well, carers leave came in as unpaid this year in April. Again, what is potential for that to go to be paid statutory leave? Probably at the same rate as the other statutory payments, but we don't know. But again, what's the definition of who can have that? If we're being paid for it, who can you choose to support? What's the definitions in there? Employers may want to consider who they define, or the government may define who you can have paid carers leave to look after. Could be parents, could be grandchildren. I don't know. There's so many options that need to be considered at that point. Okay, so I'm going to shut up and hand over to, well, in fact, I'm not going to shut up, am I? Diversity, equality and inclusion. No, I'm not going to shut up. I'm going to carry on waffling. It's fine. So gender pay gap, yeah, there is so much around gender pay gap. It's been in place for a while. It's not, in my view, particularly efficient. It sits as an HR requirement, but payroll have all the information to calculate those figures. Which regulatory body is going to look at enforcing it if they're going to extend it? Is it going to look at including outsourced workers? Is it going to be potentially rolled out to smaller employers? The way they started with auto enrollment at the higher end of the employment bandings, are they over the next 4 or 5 years potentially going to roll this out to every company? Bearing in mind how many employers there are out there with less than 250 where this gender pay gap is really a big issue. Claire, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that one.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, they haven't said whether they're actually going to necessarily overhaul the actual reporting itself or the requirements, but more so the expectation on employers of what they're then doing with that data and seeing through the actions, which, hopefully, again, we're continuing to see a positive trend in relation to the gender pay gap reporting, but it's far too slow. So anything that's going to hold employers to account and start to really break down some of those bias and cultural aspects when it comes to gender pay gap will hopefully only be a positive, but it'll be interesting to see. They've obviously said that this is also going to extend over to ethnicity and disability pay gap reporting. Both are expected to be applicable to employers with more than 250 staff in the same way as the gender pay gap reporting, and is likely to mirror the gender pay gap reports. What we don't know yet is really anything more than that. What I would suggest at this point is that you're starting to look at how you are capturing that data, where you are capturing that data, and what data you already hold. If you're anything like us, we struggle to get high levels of disclosures from employees in relation to their broader equal opportunities monitoring. It is obviously optional. There's nothing that's legally requiring them to disclose that information at the moment. So again, what is the government proposing in relation to how employers are going to capture that information and protect employees at the same time? With disclosure comes the increased risk of discrimination. So there's a lot to unpack in this one. I would, at this point, just be advising that you're starting to possibly look at the ethnic groupings and disability monitoring that the government do provide some guidance on their website, so that any data you're starting to capture is aligned with that. Could be the wrong advice, but at the moment, a lot of the much larger organisations that are voluntarily doing the work around ethnicity and disability pay gap reporting that I certainly speak to use those as a framework to make sure that they're aligning at least with some form of recognised grouping of those different aspects. So yeah, start to look at your data, start to think about how you can record that, start thinking about the cultural aspects you're going to need to consider so that your employees feel that they are able to disclose that information in a trust environment. Think about the training you're going to need to provide your managers, your HR teams. It's really a massive piece, I think, on the ethnicity and disability pay gap reporting, but hopefully a positive one. So lots to do there. And we've also seen this focus on menopause, which is great. It's great to see, I think, a spotlight shined. It's something that obviously all women will go through at one point or another in their life. And it can be hugely disruptive for those individuals, and also also employers. So I think anything that's pushing employers to make sure they're introducing these action plans where they employ more than 250 people, yet to be seen what that will look like, but anything that's going to be making some positive moves to support those employees will be for the good. They have said they're going to provide guidance and measures in consideration of things like uniform and temperature. Again, as we know, women with the menopause can typically suffer with temperature regulation, personal hygiene, thinking about the steps you can take in the same way you would consider reasonable adjustments when you're dealing with possibly disabled employees. It's about those reasonable adjustments. What is suitable for you to do as an employer to make sure that these employees are being supported in the workplace? Things like flexible working, obvious things that we're already doing, and recording menopause-related leave and absences, again, considering it in a different way than you would normal absences, like you would in relation to pregnant workers, disabled workers. So it's great to see some positive work and focus on menopause, and it will be great to just see what those action plans look like when they get issued. Okay, Julie, next steps. Oh no, me next steps. Sorry, me next steps. God, we're all over the place today, aren't we? What we're doing next. So, gosh, right, we have got lots of things. As I said, this is going to come across. I would expect we're going to see a large swathe of changes, but these will continue to happen over the coming years. So I think it's going to become the norm. I think it's really important that everyone is monitoring those developments closely, as we've kind of put here. If you have, like me, you're subscribed to 1,000,001 different newsletters, email blasts that you get. They're a great source of information to just get up to speed with what's coming out on a regular basis from the government in relation to changes, and then also starting to figure out what employers are doing. Some of this is unknown. We all remember COVID, we all remember furlough, all of us were looking at each other with blank faces. There's going to be some of that. We're all going to be rallying together to figure some of this stuff out between us, and certainly we'll be doing our bit to help you guys along the way. You will need to be creating or updating your existing contracts. We as an employer have just been through a harmonisation process across our entire workforce to get contracts in place. So my heart sunk a little bit when I just saw the scale of change that's going to have to come in, that we're going to have to do. But unfortunately, it is going to be a necessary requirement. Although, if you haven't yet done that process like us, it's a great opportunity for you to do some harmonisation if that's what you need to do and tidy things up. We're going to have lots of new and updated policies. I've listed the ones on the right that we've identified so far. There will be more, but here's just a list of those. In amending your internal processes, again, great opportunity to clean house, do that end-to-end work with your payroll teams, with your managers, with your L&D teams, to understand absolutely everything you can be doing to make sure not only you're updating your policies, but you're really getting those processes working as efficiently as possible. You're digitalizing, you're automating, you're investing in technology where you need to make sure you can really leverage the positive outputs that you're going to get from some of these things, because there will absolutely be positives. And also obviously training your managers, training your employees, training your HR department. Figure out who's going to be providing the legislative updates that are concrete, solid and reliable. But training is going to be a really key element. So again, start to get early visibility, start to map that out and figure out what that looks like. But if you're anything like me, if you've got any capacity you can drag from your team, you'll probably be thinking about how you can make this work in your benefit, and is an excuse to do some end-to-end work on those processes, policies and procedures. Julie.
Thank you. Just want to touch on how we can help, and we are here to help you. This is what we do. Our job at Ciphr is to serve the people who look after the people. So do follow us on whichever is your preferred social media channel. That will automatically ensure that you get invites to the micro webinars that we're going to be doing. So each time we've got a new piece of legislation bottomed out, we know exactly what's happening, we're going to share that with you, and we can talk about it. We can have a Q&A session, and we've got the likes of Claire, who's literally Claire Warner, her full-time job is to be 100% in sync with the government and legislation changes. So look, we'll share that with you. We'll help figure it out, and we're all in the same boat. We've all got to go through this. So look, we're here for you. And also we'll be creating content as well. So you'll get access to all of that. And if anybody is thinking of upgrading their HR or payroll technology, then we're also here to support you with that. If anybody's looking for an outsourced service for their payroll, we're also here for you for that. And with regard to the changes around D&I, if you do need any help, we offer D&I consultancy, and also on our e-learning platform, we've got an abundance of D&I material that you can access. So please just reach out. We're here to help. Thank you.
So much, everyone, for sharing your expertise, and in rapid time too, which moves us about 15 minutes for Q&A. So I know some of you have already been sending in your questions, which I've been collating for our experts. If you have more questions, please send them in. Bear in mind, we are doing our best with the publicly available information, so we may not be able to answer all of your questions, but we will give it a go. So we'll start from the top. The travelling time change, is that likely to impact employees at all levels of earning power? I couldn't find anything in the Labour documentation about restrictions or specifications there.
It should actually be paid for everybody in certain circumstances. So travel time, no, sorry, let me get that right. So commuting time is not paid travel time, but time during your working day, if you're moving from site to site, for example, should already be paid. But there are certain industries that don't pay it by default because they say it's not working time. So it could impact anybody at any level that isn't being paid for that time. Again, it's how it's reported, it's how it's controlled. But yeah, it's time at work. So there isn't clarity as yet over things like that's travelling time, but we still have the disputes over like on call and overnight payments. So there's no clarity around what they plan to do on any of that yet. So that's all up for consideration. But yes, at any level, it doesn't necessarily mean just those that are on the lower earnings levels.
Although it will be interesting to see if employers make the decision to where they're not currently paying, if they decide to pay at a lower rate than their normal hourly rate, assuming that's above national minimum wage, and have different rates for the travel time. But I think they are reviewing all of that, because I've also got a note from when I was researching ahead around also making changes to the sleep shift payment rule changes. So I think there's going to be a lot that's looking at that whole link into working time regulations and what elements should be paid, unpaid, and how they're managed. Again, just to avoid that exploitation element. But yeah, there'll be a lot in that one, I think.
Yeah, and I can see, I'm looking at the chat now, Catherine, where the supplementary questions coming through. So, do people who are being paid traveling to another country for work, is that working time? Yeah, actually, it is working time. It might not be paid working time. A company could give you time off in lieu, for example. I know it's not always considered, but it is working time under working time regs. So maybe that's something that we could do a spin-off webinar on. What is and isn't working time.
I think we definitely need a spin-off on travel time alone, looking at all the commentary that's coming through. The kind of the best way to gauge when people are traveling either overseas or staying away in a hotel overnight, wherever you say to an employee, whilst you're traveling or whilst you're at this event, you are representing the business, you've already deemed that's travel time. So that could be a really good rule of thumb, just as a quick answer to some of those questions that are coming through now, for you to gauge how you would deem that within your own organisation.
Yeah. I think this is a great example of just a line that could be put in a manifesto, and then when it comes to actually picking it and implementing it, there is so much to consider. And I read a good comment about the scale of these proposals is they are as broad as they are wide. They are wide ranging, and they are deep in focus as well. So so much change happening over the next couple of months potentially. I'm going to skip forward to some other questions. So on SSP, is the abolition of waiting days only relevant to lower earners?
No.
I didn't think
No,
so.
the statement is abolition of waiting days. So that will impact everybody.
Okay, great. We've got a couple of questions about unfair dismissal and probation periods. So do you think you'll see employers increase their probation periods in response to day one unfair dismissal rights?
Yeah, I was thinking the same, actually. They haven't obviously put anything out yet, but if I think about the other trial periods that you have, some that are more legally binding than others. So there's trial periods when you introduce a flexible working arrangement, there's trial periods if you make an offer under redundancy. I think there will be I think they will have to enforce a legal framework by which, if they're saying that unfair dismissal right doesn't apply during probation period, they're going to have to put a limit on it. Otherwise, I think most people will go, well, it's a 2-year probation period. So there's absolutely going to need to be something. I would expect that if they are saying that probation periods are going to be an exclusion to that, they'll have to provide some guidance. But as yet, we haven't seen anything to determine what that might be. I'd expect it to be 3 to 6 months, but that's just a guess.
Yeah, and we did have someone ask about feedback on our company's experience on abolishing probation periods. I think that's something for us to revisit separately, maybe as a separate piece of work, just to kind of discuss how that went, pros and cons, and where that might evolve in the future. Yeah, cool. Unless there's something you'd really like to add quickly. I know we've got a lot to get through.
Yeah, it probably did have a subtle cultural impact. It was part of a much wider onboarding experience that we wanted to provide to new starters. So it was just a small part of the puzzle. It's not like when you make a contractual change that is impacting all of your employees and you therefore can see how that's impacted. It was clearly only for those that were then onboarding. So it was subtle, but it was definitely positive.
Awesome, thank you. Questions about pay gap reporting. If outsourced workers are going to be included in gender pay gap reporting, does that mean they count towards a 250 person threshold? And that might find or similarly, if you've got people who are self-employed contractors, is that going to push people over the 250?
For me, I would say yes, because that's one of the ways companies have been getting around it. And falling under that threshold. But yes, I would suggest if they're going to look to include that, it will include anybody that they actually make any payment for or have any contract for work with. I don't know if Claire's got a different view on that one.
I think it's probably too early to say as what they're going to deem, and also if they're bringing this alongside the changes in relation to worker status and banning 0 hours, that will impact then who we're considering workers and self-employed. It'll make it a bit more clean cut. But I think this is exactly one of those things. It's broad as it is deep. It's how far does it go? So yeah, not too much certainty from me on that one, I'm afraid.
No. Someone else just popped in a useful comment just to mention that HMRC will be phasing out P11Ds. So that's something else that we will need to consider alongside this suite of changes. Sorry, Ira.
We will definitely be having a webinar.
We'll talk about that.
A webinar on
I'm writing this all down.
So yeah. This current tax year is your last year when you'll be producing P11Ds. Talk to your software providers now about getting you set up for payroll and benefits in kind. It can be set up in some systems, certainly in ours. We can do the configuration today and prepare you to switch over at the beginning of the new tax year, 6th of April 25. But we will do a session on this just to help people.
Awesome, thanks, Judy. A question about the right to disconnect. How sort of approach to managing workers who want to do the evening work, who don't want to maybe fall in line with that disconnect stuff, and kind of cultural considerations, I guess, around managing that.
I mean, I think it will depend what the legislation says and how far that goes, and if it's more a framework that enables employees to confidently disconnect. I would be surprised if it went so far as actually prohibiting people from working outside of their normal hours. I think that would be quite a negative introduction. I think a lot of it will come down to what you've got in your contracts. As long as you're making it clear that any of that work is unpaid and you're managing it in line with any of the working time regs opt-outs, and you're recording the amount of time, it shouldn't be too preventative from that still continuing. But I think it will come down to contracts, it will come down to culture, and it will come down to whatever this legislation ends up saying, unfortunately.
I mean, we may end up with something like an opt-out, which works for working time directive, something like that. Who knows? But yeah, watch this.
It will definitely sit alongside probably a lot of what we see around more doing the training and awareness around it. So it will probably be spun as more of a health and safety, mental health area where you're making sure that that as an employer, you're taking reasonable steps to make sure that your employees feel confident in their ability to disconnect, and what are healthy parameters around working outside of normal working hours, and using phones, and again, bring your own policies. There's going to be a whole IT information security angle to this, I would imagine. So again, a broad and deep topic.
Yeah, great, thank you. Just a question that's come in For the payroll team, are there plans for Ciphr payroll reporting tools to be updated or changed to support these requirements and extracting data to allow payroll teams to provide better pay data?
Yes. And hi, Zilla. Glad you're on. Pleasure to see
Thanks
your
for
name
joining.
pop up there. Yeah.
Oh, sure. There we go.
Hi.
Awesome.
Yes, they will. And we're going to be running, we're going to be setting up a special interest group purely for payroll because there's so much change that's coming. So you'll all be invited to that. We'll walk you through what we're doing, when we're doing it, and here's what we've done, and give you some training ready to take on the updates as we push them out. And I look forward to seeing you there, Zilla.
That's awesome. Thanks, Julie. I'm just going to end with one last question. So somebody shared, like, is there potential that employers are opening themselves up for discrimination claims from non-parents by making more leave available for parents? So more unpaid parental leave. We talk about carers leave and that kind of thing. I think it's a really fine line. Yet when you consider that flexible working will become a day one, not even right assumption, then maybe that kind of balances it out.
Yeah, it will do. I think you can look at any individual or collective piece of legislation when you look at all of the rights that sit around being a parent, all of the different statutory leave that are going further and further and further, and think about absolutely the flip side and the impact on those that aren't having access to those legislation. I think it's always just reminding that the legislations that are on that side are around protecting those individuals from not suffering discrimination due to those life choices, or however you want to kind of class them. Try and bubble that up in a way that isn't offending anyone on this call. But I think it's always trying to look at it from the place that legislation was originally introduced from, which was that those individuals were probably feeling that discrimination and negative impact, and it is there to protect versus negatively impacting those that aren't able to access it. But it could absolutely open up potential for discrimination, I guess, on the flip side.
And I guess we could also look at things like the Alabaster ruling, where there is already that feeling of discrimination in that somebody potentially on maternity leave could get a pay increase up to 17 months before somebody that is actually at work. There are already cases out there around that. So yeah, it's all the fallout from the rules.
It is a nightmare to navigate as an employer and try and balance all of the different legislation with just a bit of common sense and best practice and trying to do the best by all your employees. And there will always be conflicts that you have to manage. I think it is just trying to take a balanced view on each of these things as to what you think is right, as long as you're not doing anything that's going to breach those protections that are in place for the right reasons.
Awesome, thanks. I think we'll leave it there. We've covered a lot of ground today, as best we can. There is more ground to cover, as we've already seen. So do stay tuned to Ciphr's feeds, our email updates, and look out for more information as we send it through, and other opportunities to hear from us. We will try and keep you as well informed as we possibly can. Thank you, Julie, Ira, Claire, and to all of our attendees. Thank you for the research. Thank you for the engagement, and just lovely, respectful chat today. That's been brilliant. If you want more information about Ciphr, you can find us at ciphr.com. At the end of this webinar, you will see an exit survey. Please offer us feedback about how we did today and any of those areas for future topics that we could cover. Otherwise, we hope to see you again at a future webinar soon, and that you have a great rest of your day. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.